This episode of the Fine Homebuilding Podcast is brought to you by Andersen Windows. If you're a window installer, you deserve a simple choice: Andersen 400 Series windows. They're the windows contractors trust the most, based on a 2022 survey of U.S. contractors. Probably because they have fewer callbacks and extra peace of mind. And thanks to shortened lead times, they're available faster. Make your go-to windows Andersen 400 Series. Request a quote at andersenwindows.com.
Woodworkers like Andrew and I have a tendency to stand in our shops and think, would this be any better if my table saw was over there? And you need to be prepared to move that table saw and then inevitably move it back or move it somewhere else.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our regular discussion about building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Ian Swant, Production Manager at TDS Custom Construction.
Good morning.
Fine Homebuilding Editorial Director Andrew Zellner.
Hey, Patrick.
And our producer, Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Please email your questions to FHBpodcast@taunton.com. Well, it is a pleasure to see you guys on a Friday morning. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.
Always happy to be here.
Oh my goodness. So, Andrew, what have you been working on your place? Have you had time to do your basement remodel?
A little bit here and there. The big thing I did this was over the 4th of July weekend. My brother-in-law had to take a bunch of trees down at his place in northern Wisconsin, and we spent a full day from about 8 to 2 milling those trees into lumber. You know, he hired a local guy with a wood miser, and basically we moved logs and stacked, and we only restacked the lumber once, I think, which is pretty good for the first time you're doing it. But yeah, so we moved 24 trees.
What were you sawing, and what's the plan for the material?
So both he and I are hobby woodworkers, and so we got about 2,000 board feet in total. About half of that's red oak. And then, probably another quarter of that's basswood. And then, let's see, now we're down to eighth. So we've got like an eighth hard and soft maple and an eighth ash. The plan, we sawed it all into 4-quarter and 8-quarter boards in, 4-inch, 6-inch, and 8-inch widths. We got a few 10-inch boards too. And the plan is, we stacked it all on stickers in his garage. And we'll check on it in a couple of years and start building stuff.
I gotta ask, so physically and mentally, what is it like to be around a bandsaw for hours on end, schlepping wood that comes off of it?
So this was actually my second time doing this. And it's one of those things. So it was also, July in northern Wisconsin. Pretty humid, doing it in a clear spot in the yard. So there's no tree cover, no shade, sun beating down. I would say the first 2 or 3 hours were just fine. We're smart, you lift with your knees, you take your time. And then eventually that sort of fatigue hits and you start, trying to take shortcuts or, you trip on something while you're carrying stuff. And, it was really once we finished sawing everything, the sawyer packed up, we just left everything as is and took showers and slept for 3 hours and then got back at it again when the sun went down and it was a little bit cooler. But it's one of those things where if you asked somebody oh, could you move 24 trees twice today? You would be no. And why would I do that? But then you just one foot after the other. And, a day later, your brother-in-law's garage is just full of wood, which is exactly what I want in life. So.
Did you have a piece of equipment to move
have you
logs?
thought about what?
So yeah, no log moving equipment. All the logs were stacked, and then we just pulled the wood miser up next to them, with some log cants. I think that's what they're called, and
Yep.
just two of them, and you just roll logs. Luckily, the wood miser had the hydraulic lifting arms on it, so we just had to like roll the
Nice.
logs to the arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that tool called a PV? Am I wrong about that?
So it's the cant hook, I think, is what you use with the pivoting hook on it, and I want to say the PV is more of like a poking stick or something, like what somebody would use to steady themselves riding logs down a river, maybe breaking up log jams. I should really know more
Can't wait
about
to try that.
know more about logging, being in Minnesota.
What are you going to do with all this lumber?
So I'm most excited about the basswood. I've been working on building some electric guitars, and basswood is a great wood for guitar bodies. And it like came out of the logs were like very clear. I mean, basswood itself is usually pretty clear. I also have like a few sort of like wood paneling projects that I would never do unless I got access to inexpensive hardwood. So I wanted to put a new ceiling in my back porch with sort of the beadboard ceiling, and I'd like to make it out of solid wood. So I'm hoping I can get enough wood out of my share to do that too.
So, Ian, have you ever done any logging on the property or somewhere else with a wood miser?
Yeah, we have. There's a couple of local people that have wood misers. Over the years, I've toyed with buying one myself, but they seem to be kind of an expensive, like vanity project to own your own wood miser. If you're just like Andrew and I, and maybe going to do it once or twice a year. But we have a lot of standing dead ash, and we had one particular ash tree that was in the cemetery where all of my family are buried. And we realized that my grandfather planted the tree, my dad cut the tree down, and then I took it to a wood miser, had boards made out of it, and made a table for my parents out of it. So that was pretty cool.
Really cool
when we started to put all of that together.
What did you think about the backbreaking labor associated with sawing?
We had a tractor.
What were you going to say, Andrew?
I was going to echo Ian's sentiments about owning a wood miser if you're only going to saw occasionally. I feel like we probably, 2,000 board feet of wood is going to get me through the next 10 years or more of hobby woodworking projects. And so, hiring somebody for a day, if you got the trees, is probably a better cost equation than buying the machine, learning how to use it and maintaining it, and dusting it off once a year to do your sawing.
We have a local guy that if you can put the logs on your trailer and bring them to him, he only charges you like $50 an hour. It's like a ridiculously small amount of money. I think he just likes having the stuff to cut and run his wood miser. But he doesn't have the one that you sit on the back. He has the one that you have to walk alongside of. I always get a kick out of the ones that you see the guy just riding along with the bandsaw on a chair.
I think it's interesting to me is you can buy any manner of complexity with these things. You can go from a wide chainsaw with a pair of handles on it to a wide chainsaw that has tracks that ride on to make more uniform boards, and then you can go like up to probably six figures on the right wood miser, is my guess.
Yeah, I'm sure you can, but I can't think of anything more manual labor excruciating than trying to resaw something with a chainsaw with a like ripping chain on it and some guide. Two people on the side of it just reefing on the chainsaw. Just that really seems like an overabundance of manual labor for not a lot of gain. Have you ever used one of those, Andrew?
I've never done the chainsaw milling. I've used a chainsaw freehand to try to square up some logs. But even like if you watch people do it, it's 10 minutes to get through one pass on a tree, and on the wood miser, it's 20 seconds. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's almost effortless on a wood miser.
I had a little interesting adventure with our dishwasher last week. I'd been, ignoring the fact that the dishes were just simply not coming clean. And it's easy to blame the EPA because they've taken out the good chemicals of dishwashing soap. So, I tried a bunch of different stuff for a while and finally figured out that the lower washer arm was not spinning while the dishwasher was operating. And I later learned that these things are removable because they get full of dirt and minerals, and that was why wine wasn't spinning, because it's actually propelled by the water shooting out the sides of it that make it spin around. So like a 15-second video on YouTube clued me into the fact that you can easily take the washer arm off and get the crud out of it, and once I did that, it seemed to work fine. So that was quite a victory.
Dishwashers are
From
tricky.
What I remember, Patrick, you don't have a lot of luck with dishwashers.
I think it's our very bad mineral-laden water that affects that and our water heater most. I'm curious how it's going to affect the well's pressure tank, because I hear that minerals getting on the bladder eventually make that fail. But Jeff, you seem to have some experience with dishwashers. You have more than one, as I recall. Did you know that the washer arms are made to come off really easily to clean them?
Oh yes, yeah. Yeah, my old house, we used to have really horrible water, and it's like it got to the point where we just stopped using the dishwasher because it clogged so much.
Yeah,
we really could have used a water softener.
I think we could too, and that would solve that problem and a bunch of others with related to hard water. But it's so expensive, and I have trouble like dumping what amounts to dozens of gallons of water down the drain every few days to clean the resin filter. I don't know that that's good for our septic system and our well, because I don't have that much to spare. Well, should we get to some feedback? I heard from Barbara more on her shed insulation and air sealing project. She says, update, I asked my dad about my shed project. He ran a metal building business for 40 years. I asked him if I should take the screws out of the wall panels and add mastic in between them to make it airtight like on a roof. He said it doesn't work on walls. On a roof, you can stand on the seam to make it as tight as you screw the panels together through the mastic, but on a wall, even with stitch screws, every 2 feet, you can't make it really seal. There's a lot of expansion and contraction in the metal with temperature, and it opens up again. I think spray foam solves a lot of my problems in one step, like the problem of not being able to get 24-inch wide rock wool without buying twice as much as I need. I'm still going to use something sticky at the bottom of the wall before they roll in the Icynene truck. I've got a tube of Huber liquid flash coming from a giveaway on Instagram. Maybe I'll experiment with that. It's cool. So Barbara, I don't know if she had heard our show where we talked about her building, but she seems to have come to her own conclusion about spray foam even before she heard our discussion, is what I gather, which I think is probably airing today. Is that right, Jeff? Do you remember?
No, I think that's next week.
Okay. So that tells me that we had the right answer for Barbara if she came to it independently on her own. We also heard from a pair of engineers regarding our discussion of heat flows, and yeah. So this comes from Pete. Sorry, guys. Radiant heat radiates in all directions and warms surfaces it falls on. Convective heat moves via convection from hot to cold or as a function of the medium. Think ocean thermal currents. So does heat rise, sort of, as most people understand it, because most people use convection heating in their homes. This is very basic engineering, and yes, I are one. Get yourself an engineer to join the cast. Thanks, Pete.
And let me guess, the other engineer doesn't agree with him.
Well, more on that later. So I asked Pete about his background, and I asked him to be on Pro Talk, right? Here's what he said. Thanks, I think. Said something about the grounds at church a few weeks ago. We have 5+ acre. Guess what team I'm now part of at church? So he, I don't know. I don't know what we got wrong in Pete's mind. I think we said all these same things. What do you think, Ian? You thought he was talking to you. I immediately thought he was talking to me, about me.
I just always assume that I'm out there winding up engineers because that's what I did during my time in the field. So I just assumed that it carried over into this as well. But I thought that was basically what we said. We just said it much more clumsily than the way he put it. But I always appreciate the engineer feedback. It's always worth a good read.
I just want to read a little bit about Pete's bio here. I asked him, what kind of engineer he was, of course, and he said, my professional career started as a defense avionics packaging. Then I changed to telecom. I was pretty successful there back in the day. I was working on U.S. standards and asking why anyone would want to send a limited text to anyone else. And yes, I appreciated that this could go on a signaling control channel for basically no cost. A titan of industry, I am not. He says, I got involved in systems engineering. Recessions and layoffs led me to the Defense Department gig, which led me into project management where I am today. Before COVID, I was a weekend warrior at Habitat, working on Sandy recovery here in New Jersey. I did this for about 40 weekends a year for about 5 years until COVID changed the world. So yes, I know about residential construction enough to be dangerous. I know enough engineering not to be laughed at. I wish I was 25 years younger. I would swap my industry in a heartbeat. I'm guessing he would say he'd go into residential construction if I had to guess. Well, Pete, thank you. Any thoughts, guys?
You never feel less right than you do when you talk to an engineer. I do appreciate how succinct they can be, and like how much of our like a human's understanding of the world is really like through how the lens through how they view it. And because I think the point about because most people use convective heating in their homes, they assume all heating works like that. And it's always important to sort of question. It's important to question your assumptions before you get on a podcast.
I think it shows.
This show's going to take a lot longer, Andrew.
I think it shows how even we in the building trades, we get too comfortable with our own knowledge, and we assume that just because we understand how a building is put together, that it's common knowledge when it really is not. And I think that that certainly extends to structural and mechanical engineers who get a little bit too used to their base level of knowledge, just like somebody who trims houses all day would get pretty used to their base level of knowledge of how to hang doors and do trim, and get a little bit complacent about how little someone else may know about that topic.
So Pete wasn't the only engineer to write in with our discussion regarding our discussion of heat flow and energy movement. So Stephen wrote, "Hey, hello podcast team. I enjoy your podcast and I'm a longtime listener. Your podcast is full of great information and sometimes causes me to and think. The latest podcast has caused me to call BS My background is as a mechanical engineer in aerospace. My life is wrapped around heat and airflow. Talking about heat flow and radiant all followed very well. Heat flows from hot to cold, up, down, sideways, etc. This is obvious when stirring hot coffee with a metal spoon. Radiant heat follows a straight line, also in all directions, hot to cold. Stand in front of a fire or hot stove and you'll know what I'm talking about. Hot air describes the air temperature, not heat. Hot air rises because it is less dense and rises up if there is no other force, like a fan driving the air. Ceiling fans do just this by circulating air from top to bottom or bottom to top. Your discussion about heat didn't raise any concerns. When discussing that humid air is more buoyant, needs more support. Read any psychometric chart for a given air temp and pressure. Air density increases with increasing RH, relative humidity. A denser fluid will always settle downward, not rise. This is the Archimedes principle in action. If denser fluids were to rise above less dense fluid, the lakes and oceans would all be above us, not nominally below us. This isn't to denigrate Tiger Woods' observation about golf ball flight, but maybe is an example of misplacing his statement. Next time you talk with a master, get some context about golf ball flight at sea level in humid Florida versus dry Palm Springs air. I will continue to listen, but would like your team to clarify and support your statements about humid air. A little physics lesson for the listeners wouldn't hurt either. Best regards, Stephen. Okay, so I think I started this whole discussion of humid air being more buoyant than dry air, and then Ian chimed in with the anecdote about Tiger Woods and the flight of golf balls. So this, my knowledge, questionable as it is, comes from a piece that I read on GBA. Written by Martin Holliday in August of 2016. And it's the title of the piece is Where's the Moisture Coming From? And it talks about moisture buildup in unvented attic assemblies, right? And, as is common, I remembered part of the story, not all of it. And the first explanation for this phenomena came from Joe Steebrook, who's theorized that these attics were humid because outdoor moisture was being driven inward through the roof assembly. He hypothesized that morning dew was somehow being driven through gaps in the asphalt shingles by inward solar vapor drive. After conducting a few experiments, Steebrook backpedaled. He announced that inward solar vapor drive was not, in fact, responsible for high attic moisture levels. His current explanation, the moisture in the attic is interior moisture. It ends up in the attic rather than in lower floors of the house because of a phenomenon called hygric buoyancy. In an article titled Cool Hand Luke Meeks Attics, Steebrook posed and answered a rhetorical question: how come the moisture ends up in the attic space and not in the main part of the building? He asked, moisture-laden air is lighter and less dense than dry air. Moisture-laden air ends up in the attic due to this hygric buoyancy. At his Westford conference that same year, Steebrook said, I started talking about hygric buoyancy. People have been laughing at me. I've taken grief, but it's what we've been measuring. We're pretty confident that the measurements are correct. And you guys can go to the GBA piece to learn more about this and Bill Rose's thoughts on the concept of hygric buoyancy, and he was not convinced that this was the mechanism going on here. So, Stephen, thanks for reminding me that what I think is true is not always true.
And I tried to support your misplaced truth with a misplaced sporting quote. I think was his other point. I will keep my snarky comments to myself when trying to justify Patrick.
Best to do that, yeah. I'll put a link to that. I'll put a link to that story on GBA, and you folks can learn more about this phenomenon that is still actually being researched. What's going on here, and it's probably not because that humid air is more buoyant. I've later learned. All right, so this comes from Edmund. Hi, FHB Podcast. On a recent episode, the panel was pondering how many people live in each U.S. climate zone. You asked for listener help with the numbers, and I thought that sounded like fun. I pulled county-level population data from the U.S. Census and found every county's climate zone. A bit of data wrangling later, and I have numbers for you. In the attached spreadsheet, under the results tab, you'll find one pivot table with national results and a second pivot table where you can drill down to state level results. To answer the question you are debating, which U.S. climate zone is most populous, the answer is climate zone 3. That's followed very closely by zone 5 and then zone 4. But zones 3, 4, and 5 are so close it might be as well a tie. Each one covers about a quarter of the U.S. population. Most importantly, we should all spare a thought for those 166,130 people living in climate zone 8. One note, the climate zone data I found appears to be based on the 2003 IECC zones, not the new 2021 zones. This is a bi-county table of climate zones in Chapter 3 of the 2021 IECC, but they're free to access version blocks copy-pasting, nor have I found these updated data made available in a useful format elsewhere. A bit of data wrangling is fun. Manually transcribing climate zones for all 3,000 plus U.S. counties isn't. Cheers, Edmund. What do you guys think?
It's a great sheet. I really appreciate that Edmund put that together, and I'm going to see if I can get a hold of the pay access 2021 IEC so that I can finish up the data wrangling. Because when you look at the data on the spreadsheet, I pulled up Wisconsin, for instance. Wisconsin had the highest number of population that changed climate zones when they redid the new the 2021 IEC. And we had about 5.5 million people living in climate zone 6, which now all live in climate zone 5. So I would suspect that climate zone 5 probably took a lot of the people from climate zone 6, which by his spreadsheet had 20 million people. So just the Wisconsinites that moved is 1/4 of climate zone 6. So I have a feeling 5 is now the leader.
Jeff, Andrew, thoughts on this?
It's always great to have somebody in your audience who can wrangle a bit of data for you. It's interesting, to think of, I think we made some assumptions about the population, and the bulk of the population is sort of in these 3, 4, 5 zones already, but it's good to make make a hypothesis and see it verified for you. But I'm curious to see what the change looks like now, because it's based on 2003, so that's almost 20 years ago, and seeing that change, I think, is part of the story too.
Yeah, in some ways, the change might actually be the story, right? The being able to look at a sheet of data like this from 20 years ago and then looking at it as what it looks like now, and thinking about how that affects even just us as builders and home designers.
I also really like
this
that,
brought an interesting
that Edmund gave us some advice, some results, and then he asked a question too.
He also included some just absolutely gorgeous photos of a place he plans to live.
Yeah.
We should tell folks that Edmund is a neuropharmacologist with a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology. He adds, my idea of fun is admittedly a little warped. Edmund, it's great. I think that's fantastic. And I found it interesting. Like, I wondered if the insulation requirements, as one example, have changed commiserately with the movement in climate zones. So are folks who now live in a warmer climate zone, are they still required to put more insulation owing to the increasing requirements in the IRC? Or do they now put lesser amounts of insulation in their walls or ceiling because they're in a new climate zone? I have to look into this deeper.
That sounds like a great story, Patrick.
It's cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So getting to Edmund's questions, We're about to begin building a home here in Canmore, Alberta, Canada, a town of 15,000 an hour west of Calgary and just outside of Banff National Park in the Canadian Rockies. The podcast and magazine and GBA have been a great resource in growing my understanding of the building trades and building science, especially since we're planning a net zero passive house in a somewhat chilly climate. Somewhat chilly could only be how folks near Banff would describe the climate. You'd have to be Canadian. we have a fantastic. We have a fantastic team of professionals doing the real work. So my question is, how can we make our project a safe, rewarding, and pleasant, even enjoyable job for everyone who'll be working on it? My fiance is thinking about regular deliveries of home baking. I've heard Matt Reisinger extol occasionally buying lunch for everyone on the site. This podcast, among other sources, has me thinking about minimizing change orders by making thorough and considered decisions early and sticking with them and paying invoices promptly. Basically, how can we be good owners/customers? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts and suggestions. I've included a couple photos of the neighborhood for context. Ian, do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I think he's got it right with minimizing change orders, sticking to decisions, and paying promptly. And if you can do those things, you will be a Hall of Fame client. And throw in some occasional baked goods and lunch and Gatorades on the maybe 1 or 2 hot days you might have in Alberta, Canada. There you go. Treating people with respect goes a long way in treating your construction professional team as the professionals that they are by doing those things.
That's the part I was going to add. Be nice to people, be respectful, don't ask subordinates on the construction crew to do things. That all goes through the project manager or the lead carpenter or the GC, whatever. And just be nice and pay your bills.
How do you guys feel about thinking about a net zero passive house? Some of the building details have the potential to get really complicated. And so that would be one of my ideas for advice, is making sure those details are squared away and something that, everyone understands. Because I feel like if you get those wrong, or you have to redo them, or it's the first time for somebody doing these, it can be a frustrating experience.
Jeff, you've worked for folks in many different contexts. What would you say about what creates an enjoyable work environment?
I mean, all the stuff that you guys have talked about, I think, I don't know where they are in the project, but having a meeting before things begin and getting everybody on the same page so everybody's working towards the same goal is a huge thing.
Very good. Oh boy, this is a great question, and I'm glad we have our number cruncher here on the team today. This comes from William. The question is it less expensive to build the same square footage house as a 2-story or 1-story home? The first thing that comes to mind is there's less foundation and less roofing. This would lead one to believe that 2 stories would cost less than a 1-story house with the same square footage. I contend, though, this may be a wash. 2 stories would need a staircase. My plumbers charge more for working on a 2nd story. There are longer wire and plumbing runs to be made. Siding and soffit work are done off some type of scaffold, adding to the cost. I've never seen this addressed in any of the building magazines I subscribe to. Would you like to try and tackle this one? Thanks so much, William. So I've always heard that it's cheaper to build a 2-story house than a 1-story house of equal square footage. But I got to thinking about it, and I think it probably depends. I think it's a more nuanced question than simply one costs more or less than 2, or vice versa.
So I did a lot of thought work on this when we built our house, and that's how we ended up with the upside down house with the bedrooms in the basement. So I took William's question and then sort of mapped it over some of the work that I had done in planning our house. And we can link the PDF of the spreadsheet or something to the podcast page, but I think it might bear even just to put it as a blog post on the website, maybe with some SketchUp models that show the difference in how these houses would look. But I took the hypothetical 2,000 square foot single story versus 2 stories above ground, and then versus a 2-story like my house with 1 story below ground. And in the end, after kind of going through the differences and using numbers from my house and numbers from recent projects we've done at work, I got $395,000 for a single story, 2,000 square foot home, $370 for a 2-story above ground, 2,000 square foot home, and $313,000 for a 2-story home like mine, with the 1-story being below ground. The roof assembly is a big one. It's double the cost on the single story house, but then the rest of the things start chipping away pretty slowly at that gain. Everything from wall assemblies and drywall that you have to get up to the 2nd floor. William's point about plumbing and mechanical runs being longer. It ends up with a lot of things that are 10 or 15% more expensive, which quickly chips away at that 2x on the roof assembly. And you actually end up with slightly more exterior wall square footage on a 2-story above ground house than you do on a single story house. And I think that has to do with the 2 extra what would be your gable end walls on your 2nd story end up being extra walls.
Did you simply take your projects and average the costs of 1, 2 story homes?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like finishes could have...
Actually, no, I averaged the cost of excavation, foundation work, floor system, cost to build, wall assembly cost, which for wall assemblies, I included exterior siding, insulation, and drywall I did later. Windows and doors, assuming that they're basically the same all the way through, roof assembly with insulation, general mechanicals, drywall, paint, and trim. So, and as William pointed out, the trim for a 2-story house is a little bit more expensive because you have a staircase to build. It's a little bit more expensive for the below grade, just because of the difference in trim that you have to do in a basement, or still putting in a nicer basement staircase. So I did it in kind of cost code.
What I wondered about is, like, would a single story home ever be so much less or so much easier to build than a 2-story home that some of these costs would go down, even though you're potentially using more of something? Because obviously it's easy to side a ranch house, and as an example, and put the trim up. Would the labor costs ever make it a wash?
I suspect it's close, depending on the style of construction and how your builders work. If you're panelizing versus building everything on site, those are all factors. But I would say to William that I bet he's right, that it's pretty close to a wash. And if you really want to go the less expensive route, I'm pretty confident that what I did for putting the what would be the 2nd story of the house as below grade, because my lot worked for it. I'm not sure you can do a 2-story house much cheaper William, less expensive than what I did.
Thoughts, Andrew?
I think it's a good theoretical question, but if you're built, like, I think about building in a city on an infill lot, and really, because the cost of land is as high as it is, it's sort of, it's like if the less expensive route isn't always, or it may be difficult to even like find the square footage on a lot to build a single story 2,000 square foot house. And so it is like all building things, it does become very regional and local quickly. But when you've got 1,000 acres like Ian does, you can do whatever you want, right?
I totally agree that it's a great exercise, William. I know this question has come up in my previous life as a Habitat person, because obviously Habitat for Humanity wants to build the least expensive, most home for people that they can, and my recollection was that it was very contextual. Where are you building? What kind of house are you building? Are you putting in a concrete foundation? Are you doing a slab on grade? Are you doing a truss roof or a stick framed roof? Is it hip or gable? These are all things that weigh into the cost of a house. And I don't know, I think you'd have to do it case by case. On this lot, with these finishes, building this house in 1 and 2 story versions, and see how that washed out. But it's a great question.
Ian, you may not have the answer to this question, but I'm curious, is a truss roof usually cheaper than a hand-framed roof?
I've found that it like Patrick just said, it's very contextual. We have a second story addition that we're doing, and our most experienced framing guy, along with 3 young carpenters who hadn't done much framing, they were able to pre-cut all of the hip roof parts the day before, and by the end of day 2 they were taping zip sheathing on it. So what I've found recently with the cost of material is the component grade stock is very expensive and hard to find still. So your web stock and your stock for making truss parts is still pretty pricey yet. So if you are able to stick frame a roof and have the confidence in doing that, especially when it's a hip roof, which isn't all that complex to frame, but it's complex to put together in a truss package. We were confident that we could do it less expensive ourselves framing it. But we do have another addition coming up where we have a more standard gable roof that we're going to use trusses for part of it, and then hand frame the overlay connection between the addition and the house. But it is something that in the estimating process and the design process of our projects, that gets a lot of scrutiny by myself and the rest of the production team.
Interesting.
I think you have to assume that many parts of the country don't have the carpenters to stick frame a complex roof, maybe a simple gable roof, maybe a simple hip roof, but I don't think it's a given that you can find someone who's going to cut a roof for any project.
No, I agree. And I think when you get into the bigger home builds where they're building dozens of homes one right after another, and maybe you only have 3 or 4 different designs of homes, that's really where truss packages can make those homes go up very, very fast.
I want to remind folks about our podcast after show. If you're an FHB All Access member, you get to hear us blather on for another half an hour to an hour after we're done here. So if that interests you, I hope you will stop by there and check it out. And if you're not an All Access member, that's just one of the many benefits for you.
And I heard we're going to discuss one of my favorite topics from my childhood, manual labor.
You delivered that so dry in, but it's true. We're going to talk about manual labor, and it's going to be a fantastic conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
I've got great stories of my dad yelling up the stairs to my brother and I, waking us up early in the morning on every day of Christmas vacation to go do manual labor.
This comes from Nelson. Greetings, podcast crew. Longtime listener since episode 1. In fact, first-time asker. I live in a 1972 ranch-type home in rural Iowa. Directly beneath the two-car garage is a 600-square-foot concrete-floored, concrete-ceilinged, block-walled storage bunker of sorts, with a walkout door to the backyard and stairway access to the garage. It is, or was, a dark and damp space used by the original owners for storage of lawnmowers and similar household tools and equipment. I spent the last couple years fixing the groundwater intrusion, framing, wiring, and insulating the walls and ceiling. I now have a quite nice space for my hobby woodworking shop. Currently, this space is not conditioned. Because it's underground on two sides and shares a third wall with the house, it stays comfortably cool in the summer, and I get by for now with an electric space heater in our cold Iowa winters. A mini split is a likely future addition. My question is about how to deal with humidity intrusion in the summer months. I've come to the conclusion that the house was built without a vapor barrier under the concrete floor. By running a dehumidifier in this space, and it runs a lot, I can keep the humidity at my preferred level of about 45 to 50%. Preferred, that is, for comfort and also in consideration of the lumber material and my hobby woodworking activities taking place in this room. The concrete floor is visibly and continually damp, borderline wet in the areas where I have foam anti-fatigue mats in place in front of my workbench, miter saw, and table saw. When I pick up the mats for floor cleanup, I find obvious wet concrete in the exact shape of the mats themselves. And so I come to the FHB experts for any ideas or suggestions as how I can mitigate this vapor intrusion, or should I even attempt it. I've done cursory research on epoxy floor coatings of this sort typically used in garages, and this would be a doable and handsome solution, but my fear is that the relentless vapor migration through the slab into the room would sooner or later lead to the epoxy separating, flaking off of the concrete. Is this a likely scenario, or could a quality epoxy coating be an effective and successful top of concrete vapor barrier? Are there any specific products you could advise either for or against this effort? If stopping the vapor with some sort of coating product on the top of the concrete is just not achievable or advisable, my next plan of attack will be to just live with the vapor issue and continue to rely on my dehumidifier. Then, what I would like to know is, do I cover the entire floor with some sort of floor padding or anti-fatigue panel, like the sort that lock together like puzzle pieces? This would be strictly for comfort and making the floor easier to vacuum than the current pockmarked and imperfect concrete. But of course, then I would be trapping water between the rubber mat and the concrete surface, room-wide, like I currently see underneath my existing smaller foam mats. Would having that wetness under the room-wide rubber mats continually have any negative consequences with regard to the concrete floor, assuming the mats themselves are made from some type of rubber or other material that's waterproof? As someone who works in the building trades, residential, plumbing, and HVAC, I greatly appreciate the podcast for its many and ongoing contributions to the home construction and maintenance knowledge base. I feel like I learned something new from the show nearly every single episode, so thank you all for your sharing endless insights and knowledge. Regards and thanks, Nelson. Boy, that was nice. Thoughts?
So it seems like he, right now his space is in this tricky in-between of, conditioned and unconditioned space. And as a hobby worker myself, turning it into like fully conditioned space sounds awesome. And so my first instinct is to kind of look at how they do, basement retrofits, and flooring applications. And actually in my shop, which isn't conditioned space, but does have a, broken up concrete slab in it, I took the approach that Mike Pekovich did, in his shop, with a sleeper system of 2x4s on their flat with some rigid insulation in between, and then I think a plastic barrier, and then plywood on top. And that, it first of all, it gave me a flat, solid floor, But also standing on wood is way better than standing on concrete all day long. But Ian, I'm
think that
curious to hear
assembly is
what you have to
correct,
think.
excepting I would say that the vapor retarder should be directly over the slab and then build up from there instead of having the plastic just under the floor sheathing. Sounds good to me. Ian, what were you going to say?
I think Andrew's right. You have to do something over the top of the concrete. My knowledge of epoxy floor coatings is that putting them over any type of concrete that suffers from rising damp is a non-starter. It just isn't going to last, and it's a high dollar product to begin with. You could, if you really wanted to, you could go with like the dry core panels that have the dimple rubber matting on the back, and then they have like an OSB top. They run about $2 a square foot, which is why most hobbyist woodworkers like Andrew and myself would scoff at using them. They end up being a lot of money, but it could be a good spot to use them. Otherwise, what Andrew said, I think, is a good idea. And I did look up, there is a dimpled floor underlayment that they use for vinyl floor, like VCT or vinyl tile in basements, and it's a roll of dimple mat that you put over the floor, and then you install the vinyl flooring over it. That runs about 60 cents a square foot, and I think that would be an option. You could put that down and then cover it with your plywood material of choice, and probably do a little better than the $2 a square foot for dry core. But I think covering it up and just letting moisture be is going to be the way to go.
Any concerns
I'm
with
going to suggest an even lower
heavy
dollar solution. So he suggested the jigsaw mat, right? Covering the floor, that's also a vapor retarder, and it's also going to be more comfortable to walk on. If you did that so it was continuous, I think it would have a pretty darn good effect of slowing that vapor transmission, and you could perhaps run your dehumidifier less. Maybe you can't get rid of it entirely, but you're going to stop a good chunk of that moisture moving through that concrete floor. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that this moisture on the concrete floor in an older home is not always moisture moving through the concrete slab. It can also be a condensing surface because it's going to be cool compared to the air temperature. And if you have enough humidity, and he runs a dehumidifier, so that seems unlikely, but you could have condensation on the cool concrete.
Any concerns about heavy woodworking equipment on any of these suggestions? Like
Rubber mats?
That would be, rubber mats. or even the dimple mat,
Yeah, I don't know if the dimple mat with some sort of plywood over the top of it would work. My limited experience with the dry core panels is they're pretty sturdy when you get them all clicked together if you have a flat surface. But I think when you talk about how woodworkers like Andrew and I have a tendency to stand in our shops and think, would this be any better if my table saw was over there? And you need to be prepared to move that table saw and then inevitably move it back or move it somewhere else. So I think you have a good point about weight restrictions on certain types of flooring.
I think that, once again, Nelson, that's a fantastic question and a scenario that's pretty common with folks who have an old house, whether they want to have a wood shop in the basement or not. The problems are similar regardless of what you want to do down there.
And eventually you're going to want to have a wood shop in the basement. It's just inevitable if you own an old house. So.
Andy on GBA asked, I'm considering getting a spray foam insulation kit to finish sealing my rim joist, and I'm looking for a reputable supplier. I've installed 3.5 inches of poly iso blocking to the rim joist between the floor joists and would like to put a layer of foam over it to seal it in and deal with the penetrations that go through this area. I'm planning to use the foam to seal some above the top plate on the wall in a few locations also, especially where I have a cathedral ceiling. The total amount of material I need was approximately 300 board feet if I hit a nominal 1-inch thickness. What are the good brands to look for in this application? Okay. Anyone?
I've purchased from Tiger Foam before with pretty good luck, and they have a few different formulations based on where you live and if there's any shipping or VOC type restrictions or blowing agent restrictions in your state. So that's a good place to look. They tend to be a little bit more expensive than what you would just go to a big box store and purchase, but I have used Tiger Foam's product before and been pretty happy with it.
Do they sell them in like 100 board feet increments? That was sort of the thing I was noticing, is it's like 200 board feet or 600 board feet.
Yeah, I've only ever seen the like 300 board feet and 600 board feet sizes. They might be the more common ones.
Coincidentally, I tested spray foam kits for Fine Homebuilding years ago, and the title of the piece was called Spray Foam for the Rest of Us. And I went up into Justin Fink's attic and sprayed a ton of this stuff. And I would tell you that they're all pretty much the same. The secret is to get the cylinders warm. And there's some discussion on the GBA question and answer forum where I found this question. And folks who have used these things say the same thing. You got to get them warmed up if you expect to get the yield that is on the container and get a good mix of the two chemicals, because chemistry's reactions are often accelerated with temperature, and it works a lot better. So I'm going to stay out of the chemistry field after saying.
I was going to say, yeah.
Perhaps we have a chemical engineer out there who can correct us on warming the tanks.
So what do you like by warming the tanks? Is it like getting them warmer than like a standard room temperature, or is it just being aware?
If you can put them in a bathtub of water and get them up to like 100 degrees, that's what I understand is ideal. What you don't want to do is, in the dead of winter, leave them in your truck, drag them into your client's project or your project and expect you're going to get the foam yield or even that it'll react correctly. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's
interesting.
I read a number of things regarding this from folks in the weatherization industry when I did this piece for Fine Homebuilding, and they tell you not to warm the tanks with a heater or that kind of stuff because it is dangerous, right? But a bath of like hot water seems to be the preferred way if you need to warm them in a hurry. Otherwise, keep them in the house until you're ready to use them, and if you can make a warm space, it'll work better. Well, so we remind folks again about the after show that's coming right up.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a very exciting topic. We're going to really put in the hard work for the after show this time around. We'll be talking a little bit about manual labor, and I guess sharing some fun anecdotes about the crazy stuff we've accomplished, just with our own bodies. So I'm excited to talk about that. My hinges are still a little rusty from this last weekend. So it'll be a good discussion. And if you'd like to be part of that discussion, all you need to do is sign up for Fine Homebuilding All Access membership. You get access to our after show, along with full access to every issue of Fine Homebuilding, all of the great forums and discussions on our website, and videos, all that great stuff. So if you enjoy the podcast, we'd appreciate your support.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks to Jeff, Ian, and Andrew for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to FHB Podcast at taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Stay tuned for the after show.